Hi everyone. So today we will look into another very important question related to exception handling, and it is what happens when an exception occurs in catch or finally block. So this is a very common and important question which is asked in any Java interview related to exception handling. So I have given a summary of the answer, and the summary is like this: that if an exception occurs in catch block, then that exception will supersede the exception of the try block, and if an exception occurs in finally block, then that exception will supersede the exception of both try and catch block. So this is in summary, but let us look into detail as well. And for that we will look at the official documentation of Java, so which is Java language specification. So there is a section which is dedicated towards this particular topic. So let's jump over there. So section 14.20.2 of Java language specification talks about what are the different scenarios related to exception handling and exception occurrence of exception in try, catch, and finally block. So it's like this. So there are a couple of scenarios over here. So the first scenario is that if an exception of if the execution of try block completes normally, then finally block will get executed obviously, and then again there is a choice. If finally block also completes normally, then the try will complete normally, right? But if an exception occurs in the finally block, then that exception will be the one which will be thrown by the method. So it will supersede basically the exception of the try block, which we saw earlier as well in our summary, right? So let me read this thing. If the finally block completes abruptly for reason S, then the try statement completes abruptly for the reason S. So this is nothing but to say that the exception of the finally block will supersede the exception of the try block. Now, what is the next scenario? Next scenario is that if the execution of try block completes abruptly because of throw of value v, then there is a choice. So it is saying that if an exception occurs in try block, then what will happen? Then there are two primary scenarios, right? First scenario, this talks about that if that exception is assignment compatible with any of the catchable exception, and second is if it is not assignment compatible, right? This basically means that you will have if you are having a try catch block, then of course you will have a couple of catch blocks to catch the exception, right? So the first scenario says that you are having a catch block which is compatible with the exception which has occurred, and second scenario talks about if about the scenario where your catch block, none of your catch block is assignment compatible with the exception which has occurred. Now if that happens, if let's say if any of your catch block is not assignment compatible with the exception which has occurred, then what will happen? Then of course finally block will execute it, right? So this is the key thing about the finally block, that no matter what is happening, your finally block is guaranteed to get executed. So we are in the finally block. Now, if the finally block completes normally, then what will happen? That whatever the exception has occurred in the try block, the same exception will be propagated by the method. But if finally block completes abrupts normally for reason S, then the same exception will be propagated by the method. So this is, which is pretty much same as what we have seen here, right? So this is exactly this scenario which we are talking about, right? That if an exception occurs in finally block, then that exception will supersede the exception of the try block. So this is what is written. Let me quickly read just this thing. So if the finally block completes abruptly for reason S, then the try statement completes abruptly for the same reason S, and the throw of value v is discarded and forgotten. So this basically means that whatever exception has occurred in try block, that is forgotten. Okay, so this is the scenario where we have discussed that what happens if the exception which has occurred is not assignment compatible with any of the catch exception which you have placed. Now let's look at the scenario where if the exception is assignment compatible with your catch block. Then again there are two scenarios, right? Either the catch block will complete normally and then finally block will execute it, or in the catch itself you will get another exception and then finally block will execute it, right? So I would like to emphasize this thing. So note this thing, that even if the catch block is having some exception, then also finally block is getting executed, right? So which basically I would re-emphasize the same point which I had mentioned earlier, that no matter what, finally block is guaranteed to execute. So let's look at the first scenario. If the catch completes normally, then finally gets executed, and then we are pretty much at the same point what we have discussed in last 2 points, that if you are in finally block, then it all boils down to whether finally block will complete normally or it will also have an exception. If it completes normally, then whatever is the catch exception, whatever is the exception which was thrown by the try statement, that will get propagated. Oh no, sorry. So then the try statement will complete normally because you have caught the exception, right? So finally block completes normally and then try statement will also complete normally. But if an exception occurs in the finally block, then that exception will get propagated. So which basically means that try statement will not complete normally, it will complete abruptly. And what will be the reason for what will be the exception? It will be the same exception which has occurred in the finally block. So another situation, that if an exception occurs in try block, you are able to catch that exception, and finally block and then your catch block is completing normally, and now you are in finally block. And if finally block completes normally, then the try will also complete normally. But in case if finally block throws an exception, then that is the exception which will be thrown. Now the second scenario of this is that you are in your catch block, and instead of catch block completing normally, catch block has also thrown an exception. Okay, now what will happen, as we have said, that no matter what, finally block is guaranteed to execute, right? So now you are in finally block, but with an exception which has occurred from the catch block as well as from the try block. Now what will happen is that if finally block completes normally, then try statement completes abruptly for the reason R, which basically means that you are in the finally block because an exception which has also occurred in catch block. Now there is a choice that finally block is executing normally. Now there is a choice that whether to propagate the exception of the try block or to propagate the exception of the catch block, and what will get propagated is the exception of the catch block. So this is basically means that exception of the catch block will supersede the exception of the try block. Okay, now another situation of this is that if the finally block completes abruptly for reason S, then the try statement completes abruptly for the reason S. So this is basically that you are almost on the full picture here, right? That you got an exception at this particular point, you are getting exception everywhere. You got an exception in try block, because of that you went to the catch block. In the catch block again you got an exception, then you came to the finally block, and in finally block again you got an exception. And what will happen in the end? The exception of the finally block is the one which will get propagated. So basically the same point of this summary, that if an exception occurs in the finally block, then that exception will supersede the exception of both try and catch block. So this is the most important line. So it basically, if I have to again summarize this whole thing, then I'll say it like this, that exception of the catch block will supersede the exception of the try block, and exception of finally block will supersede both the exception of try and catch block. Okay, so this is the second point, and this we have already discussed that about the assignment compatibility. And the third scenario which is discussed is if the execution of try block completes abruptly for any other reason R, and then finally block is executed, and then there is a choice. If the finally completes normally, then try statement completes abruptly for reason R, and if the finally block completes abruptly for reason S, then that is the exception which will get propagated, right? So this scenario basically talks about that if the exception of a try block, if the execution of try block completes abruptly for any other reason R and finally is executed and finally completes normally, then try statement completes abruptly for the reason R. Okay, so this is basically that scenario talking about where you do not have any sort of catch block, right? This is what it is saying. That is why you are in finally block, right? If an exception occurs into the try block and you are into the final block, you're not got into the catch block. That is the reason if the finally block is completing normally, then your try statement will complete abruptly for the reason R, which is basically means that the exception of your try block will get propagated. And again, same thing, that if in finally an exception occurs, then the exception of the finally block will get executed. So it's like this. So this is how it is. It's a very important question, guys, which you should definitely be comfortable with, because it is commonly asked in Java interviews related to exception handling topic, to figure out whether candidate really knows exception handling or not. And exception handling is of course a very important topic from the Java development perspective, or in fact any development perspective for that matter, right? So make sure that you are very comfortable with this thing. I have given you the summary, as well as I've given you the section number also of Java language specification. Go through it, and then there are a couple of code blocks as well which you can try. So it will give you good hands-on on that one. Okay, so that's it for today. Thank you everyone.